Alright, you guys saw the final render at the beginning of the video. Make sure to like and subscribe for more awesome tutorials like this. All of my files I use in this video are in the description to download, so make sure you will do that if you want to follow along. But other than that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, hopping on into Blender, I'm going to go ahead and change it to cycles and then make sure I'm rendering on the GPU. I'm also going to checkmark viewport denoising and adapt the sampling so we can view it easier. Also, just a quick note, you can also see my shortcuts down here. So let's go ahead and go to the side view by pressing 1 and then Control-Alt-0 to position the camera there. Then we're going to go ahead and click on the camera object and add in a background image. We're going to make this a movie clip and then open the movie clip in the file in description. Once we have that open in the scene, we're actually going to go ahead and delete the main cube and then add a plane. This plane will only be used to align our scene, so we're just going to go ahead and hop in the camera view, go ahead and turn on wireframe, and then you can press in and come up to the view panel and go to lock camera to view, and now the camera will actually move around with us. And so we're basically just trying to line up this little thing up here around like this. I'm just going to move the camera up, select the camera over here and move this up a little bit. And now we're ready to add some objects to the scene. Okay, before we get started, let's go ahead and set some render settings. So I'm going to come over to the render properties. I'm going to change this render to a 32 sample count. And then coming down to the performance section, I'm going to change the tile size to a 512 by 512. This is because I'm actually rendering on a GPU. So if you are rendering on a CPU, make sure that it is 64 by 64. Next, I like to check mark motion blur. And as a last check, I like to make sure that color management is on Filmic. Okay, next, going out to the output properties, I'm going to go ahead and change the frame rate to 29.97, and then the resolution is fine, and we don't really have to worry about any other settings. Okay, now in our viewport, let's go ahead and turn off the lock camera to view and exit out that menu, and you'll see that we are in frame 144, and you can actually see that we have set a cup down. And so we want to make sure that we are on one of those frames so we can actually model out the cup itself. And so I'm just going to add a cylinder right here. I'm just going to kind of position that where I think it should be, about there. And then I'm just going to do some basic modeling. It doesn't have to be too fancy. It won't really be seen in the camera. So we can just do some very, very basic modeling. Trying to align it as best as we can, but then again, it really doesn't matter. So I'm just going to come like that. That is the rough outline of the shape. We only really need it to be close to the top, so this really bottom part doesn't really matter. Next, I'm going to actually add a quick material to this. Just hit new right here, and then do the dropper tool to this color right here. One last thing I forgot to do is to actually cut out a hole in the top, so we just want to come to the face select mode, select the top right here, and then just delete the face right here. Quickly gonna rename this cup because we will come back to this later, but we're ready to move on to the next step. And that step is to actually start the water simulation itself. Now if you are new to water simulation, I actually have a tutorial on the top right of the screen and in the description below, so make sure you go watch that. I'm kind of gonna go a little bit fast, so definitely make sure you know a little bit about water simulation in Blender. So let's go ahead and add a mesh cube like that. I'm just going to position it to where it's under the cylinder like this, and then scale that up a bit. And so now I'm going to go into the side view, hit F3, and then I'm going to type in quick liquid. Once we have this, we should see a box has popped up, and this is actually our domain. So let's go ahead and scale that up a bit like this, and then move that up right here. Basically, we just need a little thing for the water to come up here. Before we mess around with the domain and the cube, let's actually add our force field. This will actually propel the water upward to make it look like we are waterbending. So I'm just going to add, coming down here to force field, and we're just going to do the first one, force. You should see that this pops up now, and we're just going to, again, move this kind of below the cube like this. We can actually go ahead and hide our cup. We don't really need it now. It just clears up some room. So this is the part where we actually have to animate our force field. And so we're going to come over here to the camera view. We're going to look at my hands, and we're going to see when I start to raise them up, like I'm starting to waterbend. So about right here, which is frame 133 for me, we're going to hit the I key and then hit location. This has created a location keyframe. So now if I want to come up to, I want to say around 150, we can actually lift this up to about right here, I believe. Again, just hitting G and Z, and then we're gonna again hit I to add another location keyframe. Okay, so now that we have that, we want to locate the keyframe where I actually stop, my hands go down. So let's go ahead and extend this just a bit to 1000, and so we can kind of move through here and see when I actually put my hands down, and that's when we want to add another location keyframe. Okay, so for mine it was around 365, but you kind of want to test around if you're doing it with your own clip. And so now we're just going to hit I again in the same location and hit a location keyframe, and you should see that a bar has formed down here. Now that we have the basic keyframes around, let's actually add some modifiers to change it up a bit. So I'm just going to quickly drag another scene out here, and then gonna go to the graph editor right here, and you'll see that all of this is here. You can actually hit this drop down to reveal the X, Y, and Z location. What we want to do is select all of the locations. Then by hitting the N key, we can open up this little menu right here, and then going into the modifiers section, we can add a noise modifier. Now we're gonna have to do this with all of the locations individually, so X, Y, and Z, so it's all the same steps. Now once we have this, we can just play around with the scale a bit until it's a lot smaller, so it's not as jittery. And so if we just play that a little bit, I'm just going to go ahead and disable the background images so we can actually see it at a reasonable FPS. So now if we play it, we can actually see that our force field moves back and forth slightly, and we don't really want it too fast, so this is a good motion. And I'm just going to quickly do this for the other things. So again, add a noise modifier and just scale up the actual noise. Okay, so now that we have noise on all of the X, Y, and Z location, we are actually done with the animation for the location for the force field. So we're just going to go ahead and close out of there and get back to our main scene. Okay, now let's add some properties for our force field. We're going to come over to the force field properties right here. And then the type is again on force. You want to make sure that is the case. And then we're going to mess around with all these values down here. Now for the strength, if we put it up, it'll actually push away particles and anything that we want to be affected. And so we actually want to make it a negative number. I'm going to make mine a -14. I find that to work the best for me. I'm also going to add a little bit of noise. Between 1 or 2 is where I usually like to stick. And now coming down here to the fall off section, this is actually probably the most important to make it look like the actual water is falling. And so we just want to increase this power. I found in testing a 0.55 works for me, but water simulations, you just want to mess around with all the properties and change it bit by bit and see what works for you. Now we're gonna hit this use minimum button, and I'm gonna set this minimum distance. I want it to be around the first ring right here, so anything inside of that minimum distance is going to be attracted, and anything outside of it is not going to be as attracted. I think around a 1.1 is going to work for me, but again, just stick around to the first little ring right here. So if I turn the background images on just real quick, we can actually see what I do in the scene. And so if I come down, you see my arms kind of go down, and so that's when we want the water bending to kind of quote unquote stop, you know. And so to do that, we're going to play around and animate this strength field right here. And so right around 165 for me, basically whenever you want it to stop, you want to go to that keyframe and then have the strength still set to -14, and we're just going to hit this little button right here that'll add a keyframe, and then we just want to go 1 frame over and then make this a 0 for the strength, and then just press this little button again and that'll add a 0 keyframe. So now if we go before, it'll be -14, but after it will be 0. So that should be all the settings for the force field. We might have to come back later and tweak it. Water simulations are very random, so you just kind of have to figure out what works for you. But now let's mess around with some of the actual fluid simulation. So for the cube itself, we don't really need to change anything. All of these settings are good right here. You do want to make sure that it is set to geometry. And now coming over to the domain, we can change around some settings in here. For now, I'm going to leave it on 32 samples just so we can get kind of the motion correct, and then we can do a higher sample count later. And so the time scale I'm going to set to a 0.6 because Blender's default is a little too fast for me. And then skipping all these steps right here, we don't really need those. Coming down to the actual liquid settings itself, the flip ratio is fine, but we do need to turn down the particle radius. Coming on down, we'll also see the sampling tab. We're going to go ahead and change that up to 4 just to get a little more particles. And then we're going to add a bit more randomness to randomize where the particles actually spawn. And finally, in this cache section, we're actually going to set our frames. And so if we go to the force field, we can actually see that our starting frame is about 133, and then our ending frame is, let's say, 390. So we're actually going to set that for the start and end. So let's set it to 390 and then 133. Here are those settings. I know my face cam gets in the way sometimes. So next we're actually going to change the type to be modular. And now we'll see that two buttons have now emerged. This bake button right here, and if we go into the mesh section, this bake mesh button has actually appeared also. One more thing before we bake the data is to save on some space. We're actually going to disable this floor right here. And so if we come, again, I'm just going to disable the actual background images just to make the viewport more smooth. We're going to come to about right here, I think, and we're actually going to come make sure the domain is selected. And then in the physics properties, we're going to hit this little button beside bottom. And then again, we're just going to come one frame over and then uncheck that and make another keyframe. Okay, now everything is set up to actually bake the data. So with the domain selected, we're going to come up to the settings tab right here and hit the bake data button. Now this bake should go by pretty fast, and that is because we have a low resolution. Once we are happy with the results of the bake, we'll actually up that resolution so we get a better result. But if we go ahead and play what I have right here, we'll see that the actual liquid follows the particle and kind of stays up in air. And if you see at the bottom here, the unused particles actually disappear in the floor itself. So one thing to keep in mind, let's actually unhide our cylinder like this. We want to make sure that no particles actually go to the left and right of the cylinder right here. And so if I kind of scrub through, we'll notice that none of the particles really move outside of this. We don't really care about the splashes and stuff down here because we'll mask that out later. But what we really care about is that no particles go in kind of this area, or else the actual masking will be harder. Okay, once you have a result that kind of resembles mine or like this, you can actually come over here and hit the free data button. And for the sake of my tutorial, I'm going to increase this to a 128. But for you, if you're doing a more intensive scene and stuff, make sure to get that as high as you can, as high as your computer can run it. Again, we're just going to hit this bake data button and let it bake. Okay, so once that finished baking, we have this result right here. It looks very cool, and you'll notice that I actually do have a little bit coming on the side right here, but it's so minuscule that we can actually hide that later, so I'm not too worried about that now. Now that I'm happy with this motion, I'm going to go ahead and come back to the domain into the mesh properties. We're going to check mesh, and then I'm just going to leave the upscale factor to 2, but if you are doing a more intensive scene, make sure to increase that by however much you can, and then we're just going to hit this bake mesh button. Okay, so my mesh just finished baking and we got this result right here. And so this is looking really good. Let's actually get into the shading and the final composite. So first things first, I'm going to actually add a HDRI to our scene. I just already downloaded a HDRI. It should be in the download folder. It's just from HDRI Haven, but I made sure to match the actual scene I was shooting in as well as I could. And so with this, we should see that we now have this. If you see a white background, make sure that you come to the render settings to film and make sure that transparent is checked. Okay, now with our domain selected, we can actually change this to the object, and we'll see that this node has already been set up for our water. I usually like to come to this color and kind of decrease the S value a little bit. I find that it's a little too blue, so that makes it a little more white. Next, coming back to the layout tab, let's actually get rid of this cube right here. So I'm just gonna select this right here, like this, and then coming up here, I'm going to enable these two settings right here and then just turn all those off, so now it won't be rendered at all. Next, I'm going to set up the cup to only affect the reflections in the shadow, and so to do that, just make sure the cup is selected. Come over here to the object properties, and in the visibility section, we're going to turn off the camera and the shadow. And so now you'll see that we actually have some green right here. And now if we come back up to the camera and enable our background image again, we can see that the cup is actually not aligned, and I like to make it a little more up here. I know it's not really realistic, but it blends in the scene a little bit better. So with the cup selected, I'm just going to move this cup up until there's a little bit of green showing through the top right here. Okay, so to add a little bit more realism, we're actually going to import some images as planes. And so just type in planes if you hit the F3 menu, and you should be able to import a image. Now this is just a single frame that I already rendered out of the background. it should be in the file down below. If for any reason you don't see the import images as planes, just go to edit, preferences, and then type in planes right here and make sure that this is checked. Okay, so now we're just going to scale up this little plane right here. We're basically just trying to make the wall behind the water, give that a little bit of color and match it to the scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this a bit back like this. And then again, we just want to cover up that whole frame. We don't really have to worry about any of the other stuff around here. We only care about this kind of wall color. And so now that that's set up, if we go into rendered, we'll notice that the plane is actually visible. And so a way to get rid of that is to actually come to the object properties. And again, we're just going to set camera and shadow off. Now that we have that, we are actually ready to do our final composite. Now to save on some render time, we're actually going to go to the exact frame where the water kind of meets the top of the cup right here, because we won't really be using that. And so let's go, for me, it's going to be around, so for me that's going to be frame 152. This is where the water is below the cup last, so I'm going to make that my start frame down here. And for the end frame, we just want where the water falls back down and where it last is seen by this little thing right here. And for me, that's going to be frame 381. So I'm just going to make that my end frame real quick. Okay, quickly, I'm just going to delete this little lamp right here. We don't really need it. And then let's actually do some render settings. So first, I'm going to go to the Compositing tab, hit Use Nodes, and then I'm going to quickly add a denoise node right down here. Then I'm going to come over to the View Layer Properties, make sure that denoising data is actually turned on, and then we're going to put the noisy image into the image, the normal into the normal, and the albedo into the albedo. And then finally, we're going to make sure that the final image socket is plugged into the composite node. Okay, so now coming over to the output properties, we're going to make sure that our resolution and frame rate is correct, which they are. And then we're actually going to make a folder where this is outputting to. I would recommend making its own folder because there are going to be a lot of images that are going to be put in it. So let's just come down here, make sure it's on PNG, RGBA, and then compression, I like to turn that down to 0. And now we are actually ready to render the animation. So I'm going to come up to the render tab and hit render animation. Okay guys, now that we have the final image sequence ready to go, we're ready to start actually masking and compositing. So let's go ahead and jump back into Blender. And then I'm going to come back to the layout tab, and then instead of the 3D viewport, we actually want to come over to the movie clip editor. Now we can come up to the top and select our water bending clip like this. And then as you can see, we're just gonna quickly change it to mask up here, and then you just want to hold Control and then click right here. You kind of just want to mask out the top area like so. Try to get it as accurate as possible. Luckily when I filmed this it was stationary, so we don't have to animate the mask at all. So whenever you're filming for yours, it might be easier to just make it stationary. So like this, so just go over the top, and then I'm actually gonna bring it out here and kind of do a mask just to eliminate all of the bottom. And then once we have it over here, we can just hold Alt and then press C to close up the mask. Okay, now we're ready to do our final compositing. So if we just go to the Compositing tab, we want to make sure that we are on the standard color management now that we're not actually rendering from the render layers. And so then we can actually come and delete these two nodes right here. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and add a movie clip node. This is going to be our background, our actual video itself, and so we can just open that right here. So I'm going to quickly add a viewer node. I actually have a add-on called Node Wrangler downloaded, so just go to the add-on section and type in Node Wrangler and make sure that is checked, and then come back here, and then I can just hold Shift, Control, and then click to add a viewer node like that. Next, I'm going to add our image sequence that we made, and so we want to add a image node, and then we're going to go open that folder where we have all the images stored, and we're just going to hit A to select them all, and then open image like that. And you can see it already selects image sequence right here. We can see that it is 230 frames long, but the first frame does not start on frame 1. We actually want to change that to whatever your first frame was down here. So mine was 152, and so we're going to come down here and type in 152, so that way it starts on frame 152 instead of 1. Next, let's combine them by adding a alpha over node like this. Let's connect the movie clip and then the image sequence like this, and let's give that a quick view. So as you can see, this is what we have right now. We're going to go ahead and hit this convert to pre-multiply node. Let's just uncheck that. We'll plug this in at the very end. So as you can see, we now have our image sequence on top of our movie clip, and because our image sequence was saved as PNG, we actually have transparency. so they are overlaid pretty nicely. Next, let's bring in that mask we just created. So we want to make a mask node like this. Just bring this up here and select that mask that we made. We only made one, so it's just that one. And then plug that into the factor already. You will notice that nothing has happened, and that is actually because the mask is inverted. And so to undo the invert, we want to do a invert node. And now we should see that this should disappear like this. And now if we go to a later clip, we should notice that the mask is now the right way. If we zoom in a bit, we can notice that the mask is kind of pixelated, and so what I usually like to do is to just add a quick blur node. This will basically feather that edge a little bit, and so I'm going to set it to fast Gaussian, and I think somewhere between 2 and 5. You don't want to do it too much, but you also don't want to do it too little, and so that is looking good like that. Finally, to render this out, let's just go ahead and set up some quick settings right here. Make sure that you are on the standard colored management, then just go into output properties. We're going to go ahead and change the file location. This one we don't really have to create a new folder because we're just saving it as a MP4 file. Next, we're going to come down to the PNG, change that to FFmpeg video, change it to MPEG 4, and then put this to high quality. And finally, we just want to set the start and end frame. So the start frame is 1, and then the end frame for me is 423. And so now we are ready to render. Okay guys, here is the final result. I think this turned out really well, and I had a really fun time making it. The other elements are in the works, so make sure you guys like and subscribe for more of those videos. Also, leave a comment down below on what tutorials you would like for me to do next. I also just want to remind you guys that we now have a community Discord and a Patreon, so make sure to go support us on there to become more connected with our community. Anyway guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.